There is a difference between a political embarrassment and a national security warning. A political embarrassment is when a senior official gives a bad interview, fumbles a line, or gets dragged for acting ridiculous on television. A national security warning is when the person running the FBI is being described by people around him as erratic, frequently absent, difficult to wake, and allegedly drinking heavily enough that meetings have to be moved, decisions get delayed, and agents inside the building start losing confidence that the chain of command is functioning. That is the real story here. The headline is going to tempt people to turn this into tabloid material. The temptation is obvious. There are allegations of drinking. There are stories about private clubs in Washington and Las Vegas. There is even the kind of detail that instantly goes viral. A report that at one point officials allegedly considered breaching locked doors because they could not reach the FBI director. That kind of detail spreads because it sounds surreal. But the real story is not that the allegations are colorful. The real story is that if even part of this reporting is true, the Bureau is not dealing with a personality problem. It is dealing with a reliability problem at the very top of one of the most sensitive institutions in the United States. And that is a completely different category of crisis. According to the reporting at the center of the scandal, multiple officials described Kash Patel as erratic, frequently absent, and prone to heavy bouts of drinking. Several sources said he was known to drink to obvious intoxication, even around other administration staff. 6 different sources reportedly said meetings and briefings had to be pushed later in the day because of alcohol. Few nights, other officials said his own security detail at times struggled to wake him up. One account went even further and claimed that when Patel was unreachable behind locked doors, officials requested breaching equipment to get to him. Now stop there for a second. Do not treat that like gossip. Ask the only question that matters. What happens to a security institution when the people around the director no longer trust that the director will be reachable, clear-headed, or operational when the moment turns serious? That is the center of this story, because the FBI is not a symbolic agency. It does not exist to produce good television clips. It sits at the intersection of counterterrorism, counterintelligence, organized crime, cyber threats, politically sensitive investigations, and emergency coordination. It is the kind of institution where delay itself can become damage. If decisions bottleneck at the top, investigations stall. If the top official is absent, uncertain, or impaired, the people beneath him do not merely get annoyed. They start improvising around weakness. And once a national security bureaucracy begins improvising around its own leadership, you do not have discipline. You have drift. That is why some of the most important details in this scandal are not the lurid ones. They are the operational ones. Officials reportedly said Patel's presence at FBI headquarters and field offices had been irregular. They said his chronic absence compounded existing bureaucratic bottlenecks and delayed time-sensitive decisions needed to advance investigations. One source said the delays pushed normally unflappable agents to the point of losing their minds. That is not a superficial complaint. That is what institutional stress sounds like before it becomes institutional dysfunction. And then there is the part that should make every serious person pause. The Justice Department's own ethics handbook bars employees from habitual excessive alcohol use. The Inspector General has warned that off-duty alcohol abuse can impair judgment and make employees vulnerable to coercion or exploitation by foreign adversaries. That language matters. Because once you are talking about the FBI director, you are not talking about a private citizen embarrassing himself at a bar. You are talking about someone who would sit near classified information, active operations, sensitive personnel matters, intelligence coordination, and the kind of knowledge hostile governments would pay almost anything to penetrate. So the scandal is not really about morality. It is about exposure to mistakes, exposure to bad decisions, exposure to manipulation, exposure to the possibility that the person at the top of one of America's most important security agencies is not consistently operating at the level the job requires. And that is before you get to the stories about impulsiveness. The reporting also described Patel as suspicious of others, prone to jumping to conclusions, and vulnerable to public overreaction before facts were settled. One of the most revealing episodes was almost absurd on its face. Patel reportedly struggled to log into an internal computer system, became convinced he had been locked out, panicked, and began telling aides and allies that he had been fired from the White House. Members of Congress and people inside the FBI reportedly began calling to ask who was now in charge. Think about how abnormal that is. A login problem becomes a personal purge fantasy. A brief technical confusion becomes a chain of common scare that is not just stress, that is a failure of internal ballast. The same reporting tied broader concerns to Patel's handling of public moments including premature or inaccurate information around high-profile incidents. And again, the important point is not whether one man sometimes posts recklessly. Plenty of people in politics do that. The important point is what happens when the person doing it is the FBI director. At that level, impulsiveness does not stay impulsive. It becomes institutional. It enters press cycles, affects public trust, distorts active cases, and forces career professionals to clean up after volatility from the top. That is why the White House reaction matters too. Trump's posture appears split. On one side, he reportedly likes Patel's willingness to purge the agency and is not especially bothered by internal complaints. On the other side, he is said to be unhappy with Patel's television performance, unhappy that Patel has not moved fast enough against the president's enemies, and personally uncomfortable with visible alcohol use. That last part matters because Trump has a long and well-known aversion to alcoholism given his family history. So you end up with a strange, unstable equilibrium. Patel may still be politically useful, but usefulness is not the same thing as security. And that is the structure of the danger. As long as Patel remains useful, the system may tolerate the instability. As soon as he becomes more costly than useful, the same people defending him now may decide he has become disposable. That is why reports that officials are already discussing replacements should not be dismissed as ordinary palace intrigue. They suggest that inside the administration, at least some people think this has moved beyond bad press Patel, as response has been exactly what you would expect from a figure trying to survive a credibility crisis in Washington. He has denied the allegations, attacked the media, framed himself as the target of a smear, and sued The Atlantic and its reporter for $250 million. Legally, that is a very high bar to win. He would need to prove actual malice, not just that the story hurt him, but that false claims were knowingly or recklessly published. That means the case does something dangerous for him as well as for the outlet. It opens the door to discovery, and discovery is where rhetorical warfare meets documentary evidence. If Patel really wants to turn this into a courtroom battle, he may eventually have to decide whether he wants the entire machinery of testimony, communication, scheduling records, internal messages, and witness scrutiny turned loose on the story he says is false. That is not always a comfortable process for the person filing the lawsuit. So where does that leave this scandal, right at the point where Washington scandals become serious? Not when the first allegation drops, not when social media starts laughing, but when the story stops being about image and starts becoming about whether an institution can still trust its own leadership. The FBI director scandal that no one saw coming is not really a story about nightlife, ego, or one man's erratic habits. It is a story about whether one of the most sensitive agencies in the American state is being run by someone the people around him increasingly describe as unstable, absent, and difficult to rely on. If that picture is false, Patel's future depends on destroying it completely. If that picture is even partly true, then the bigger scandal is not that it happened. The bigger scandal is that the country put him there anyway.